The winter of 1843 struck the upper Mississippi Valley with a cold so severe that settlers recorded temperatures 30 degrees below what their almanacs predicted. In a single-room cabin near Fort Snelling, Minnesota, a family woke to find frost coating the inside walls. The fire had burned low overnight. Outside, the thermometer read 42 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The father rose in darkness, pulled back a layer of ash from the hearth, and found what he needed. Embers still glowing red beneath the gray powder. He fed them kindling, built the flame back up, and averted disaster. One failed firebank, one morning without hot coals to restart the blaze, and the family could freeze before help arrived. This was not rare, it was a routine. And across the American frontier, from the plains of the Dakotas to the forests of the upper Midwest, settlers faced winters where survival depended on architectural precision, relentless labor, and the willingness to borrow knowledge from others. The log cabin, often romanticized as a symbol of rugged independence, was in reality a sophisticated thermal machine. Its walls were not simple stacks of timber, but carefully engineered barriers against wind, cold, and death. The men and women who built these structures did not invent them. They inherited techniques refined over 5,000 years, carried across the Atlantic by immigrants who had survived similar winters in Scandinavia and northern Russia. The question was not whether the log cabin could work in North America. It was whether the settlers could execute it well enough to live through the night. The log cabin arrived in North America in 1638, brought by Swedish and Finnish settlers along the Delaware River. These immigrants came from regions where winter temperatures regularly plunged below freezing, where timber was abundant, and where survival depended on speed and thermal efficiency. They brought with them a building method that had been tested for millennia. Archaeological evidence suggests log construction originated in the Bronze Age, around 3500 BC, in the forests of Scandinavia and northern Russia. By the time it reached the American frontier, it was not an experiment. It was proven technology. The advantage was speed. A skilled team of Finnish or Swedish builders could raise a cabin in a single day using only axes. No nails, no complex joinery, just interlocking logs notched at the corners to lock into place. This speed mattered in a landscape where winter could arrive suddenly and shelter meant survival. The technique spread rapidly across the frontier, not because it was novel, but because it worked. The settlers who lacked this inherited knowledge, those who tried to improvise or adapt methods from warmer climates, often did not survive their first winter. But raising the walls was only the first step. A stack of logs, even carefully notched, left gaps. Wind slipped through. Snow drifted in. Vermin found entry. The structure had to be sealed, and this sealing process revealed the true engineering sophistication of the frontier cabin. Settlers used two materials, chinking and daubing. Chinking was the filler, wood shims, stones, or oakum packed into the larger gaps between logs. Daubing was the plaster that covered the chinking, creating a smooth, airtight seal on the exterior. Daubing was not just any random mud, it was a biocomposite material, engineered through trial and error to meet specific demands. The base was clay mixed with sand, sometimes with lime added for hardness, but clay alone cracked. Temperature swings caused the logs to expand and contract. The daubing had to flex without breaking. Settlers added binders, which included straw, moss, and animal hair, to give the mixture tensile strength, and they added fat. Animal fat, lard, or tallow rendered from butchered livestock made the daubing hydrophobic. It repelled water, prevented ice buildup, and kept the seal intact through freeze-thaw cycles. This was material science without laboratories, chemistry without formal training. The settlers who got it right survived. Those who didn't spent their winters fighting drafts and losing heat. Windows posed another problem. Glass was scarce and expensive, so settlers improvised. They stretched paper across window frames and rubbed it with animal fat until it became translucent and waterproof. Some used animal bladders, scraped thin and dried. The result was dim light and minimal heat loss. Comfort mattered less than thermal retention. But the logs themselves provided passive insulation. Hardwoods like oak and chestnut were common in the eastern and midwestern regions. In the northern forests, settlers preferred white cedar, fir, or pine because these species resisted rot and were easier to work with. The density of these logs slowed the transfer of heat from inside to outside. A well-chinked, well-daubed cabin could maintain an interior temperature significantly warmer than the exterior, even when the fire burned low. Meanwhile, maintaining that fire was a ritual. Wood collection was an exhausting and dangerous work. Settlers had to venture into frozen forests, fell trees, haul them back, and split them into usable pieces. The labor cost was immense. Ignition was equally difficult. Flint and steel could start a fire, but in the cold, with numb fingers and damp tinder, the process could take minutes or longer. A family could not afford to let the fire die completely. So every night, before bedtime, the father or eldest child performed the firebank, which involved raking the embers into a tight pile and then covering them with a thick layer of ash. The ash acted as insulation, slowing the flow of oxygen and trapping heat. By morning, the embers were still hot. Kindling caught quickly. The cabin warmed, and the family survived. However, in cases where firebanks failed, ash kicked aside and logs burned too quickly. Embers died. When this happened, the family faced a life-threatening emergency. The only solution was to borrow fire from a neighbor. A child or adult would dress in layers, walk through the cold, sometimes for miles, and return with a tin pail of hot coals. This act shattered the myth of the rugged individualist. Survival on the frontier demanded cooperation. A failed firebank meant dependence on someone else. However, some settlers engineered a more permanent solution. German immigrants in the Midwest built house barns, structures that placed livestock quarters directly adjacent to or beneath the human living space. The logic was metabolic. A cow, a horse, or a pig constantly generates heat. By integrating animals into the thermal envelope of the home, settlers reduced the labor required to collect and burn wood. The animals became passive heaters. The warmth was reliable and required no additional fuel. 20th century agricultural engineers would later formalize this principle, recommending that barns for dairy cows be no wider than 34 feet to maximize the distribution of animal-generated heat without the need for supplemental heating. Hay and straw stored in the loft above added another layer of insulation, trapping warmth below. But proximity to animals came with costs. Cholera, tuberculosis, and other diseases spread more easily when humans and livestock share enclosed spaces. Settlers understood this risk, but they accepted it. In the depths of a 40-below winter, staying alive through the night took precedence over concerns about long-term sanitation. But that was not all. The fireplace itself was a thermal mass device. Settlers built hearths and chimneys from local stone or clay. These materials absorbed heat, while the fire burned and radiated it back into the cabin after the flames died down. The design required balance. The chimney needed enough draft to vent smoke safely, but too much draft would pull warm air out of the cabin and replace it with cold air from outside. The best fireplaces achieved equilibrium, enough airflow to prevent smoke buildup, but not so much that the cabin lost heat faster than the fire could produce it. This was engineering by iteration. Families adjusted, rebuilt, and refined until they found the design that worked. Surviving the cold was only half the challenge. Isolation meant that settlers had to preserve enough food in summer and autumn to last through the months when resupply was impossible. A failed harvest or a botched preservation effort meant starvation before spring. Settlers built specialized infrastructure to manage this risk. The root cellar was not a hole in the ground. It was an engineered microclimate. The goal was to maintain a stable temperature between 35 and 40 degrees Fahrenheit and a humidity level between 90 and 95%. This range prevented both spoilage from warmth and desiccation from dryness. Settlers achieved this through careful design. They dug the cellar underground, using the earth itself as insulation. The ground temperature below the frost line remained relatively constant year-round. They left the floor as packed earth, which retained moisture and kept the air humid. Wooden shelves held root vegetables like potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions, arranged to allow airflow. Ventilation was critical. As vegetables aged, they released ethylene gas, which accelerated ripening and spoilage. Settlers installed ventilation shafts to vent this gas and regulate temperature. The shafts were simple, but their function was precise. By controlling temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition, settlers manipulated the conditions that determined food longevity. They did not understand the chemistry in modern terms, but they understood the results. A well-managed root cellar could keep vegetables edible for months. In the coldest regions, settlers harvested ice. The work was brutal. When rivers and lakes froze to a thickness of 10 inches or more, teams of men ventured onto the ice with saws and hooks. They cut blocks, each weighing hundreds of pounds, and hauled them to shore. From there, the blocks were transported to ice houses. The insulation slowed the melting process. Ice harvested in January could last through summer, providing below-freezing temperatures for dairy, fish, and meat. The labor was described by those who did it as backbreaking and miserably cold. It was also essential. Without ice, perishable food spoiled within days. Also, meat preservation required different techniques. Large kilns provided enormous quantities of protein, but only if the meat could be stored. Settlers adopted methods learned from indigenous peoples. One technique, taught to mountain men by the Shoshone, was cold smoking. The process required precision. A fire pit was dug several feet away from the smokehouse. An underground stone tunnel connected the pit to the smokehouse. Smoke from the fire traveled through the tunnel, cooling as it moved, and entered the smokehouse at a low temperature. This prevented the meat from cooking. Instead, the smoke cured the meat, depositing creosote and other compounds that inhibited bacterial growth and dehydrated the tissue. Properly cold-smoked meat could last up to 2 years. The contrast with hot smoking, where the meat is cooked and spoiled quickly, was stark. Settlers who learned the difference survived, and those who did not lost their winter protein supply. Another method was potting. Cooked meat was packed tightly into jars, and the surface was covered with a thick layer of rendered animal fat. The fat solidified, creating an impermeable barrier that blocked oxygen and prevented microbial access. This anaerobic seal stopped oxidation and decay. The meat remained edible for weeks or months, stored in cool, dry cellars. The logic was simple. No air, no spoilage. The execution required precision. Any gap in the fat layer could compromise the seal. These preservation systems demanded front-loaded labor. Settlers worked hardest in summer and autumn when conditions were tolerable to prepare for the months when work became impossible. They dug root cellars in frozen ground. They harvested ice in sub-zero cold. They butchered and smoked meat immediately after a kill, regardless of convenience. The preparation paradox was brutal. The best time to rest was also the only time to prepare. Exhaustion during the warm months purchased survival margins during the cold. The solutions developed by American frontiersmen paralleled those of indigenous peoples across the subarctic. In Alaska, the Yupik, Aleut, and Athapascan groups built semi-subterranean sod houses. These structures featured frames of wood or whalebone covered with thick layers of sod and earth. The design leveraged the insulating properties of the ground, just as root cellars did. The homes were small, with interior spaces averaging less than 1 square meter per person. This tight volume allowed body heat and small oil lamps to warm the space adequately. The physics were identical to those governing the frontier cabin. Minimize air volume, maximize insulation, and seal every gap. Indigenous builders in Siberia and northern Canada used similar techniques. The materials varied, including bone instead of timber and snow instead of sod, but the principles remained the same. Survival in environments where temperatures reached 40 below zero demanded specific architectural responses. The successful structures, whether built by European settlers or indigenous peoples, converged on the same solutions. This convergence was not a coincidence. The subarctic imposed non-negotiable thermal requirements. Cultures that met those requirements survived, and those that did not disappeared. The frontier cabin was not a European invention imposed on a blank landscape. It was a synthesis. Scandinavian immigrants introduced interlocking log joinery, a technique refined over millennia. Indigenous groups contributed cold smoking techniques, cache pits, and knowledge of local materials. German settlers introduced the house barn. Each group adapted, tested, and refined methods under the relentless pressure of the environment. The winter acted as a filter. Techniques that failed were abandoned. Techniques that worked spread rapidly. The cabin that emerged was not the product of a single culture, but the result of pragmatic syncretism, the willingness to adopt any method that increased the odds of survival. But this willingness contradicted the mythology of the rugged individualist. The American frontier is often portrayed as a proving ground for self-reliance, a place where lone families carved out an existence through sheer determination and perseverance. The reality was more complex. Cabin raising required multiple families working together to lift and position heavy logs. Fire sharing created dependencies that could not be ignored. Ice harvesting demanded coordinated labor. The individual could only be self-reliant because the community provided a safety net. Knowledge was shared, tools were borrowed, embers were given freely. The myth of independence obscured the fact that survival was a collective achievement. The cultural traits fostered by the frontier were real, but they existed within a framework of cooperation. A man was judged by his ability to contribute to communal efforts, not by his capacity to isolate himself. The frontiersman who refused to help his neighbor raise a cabin, or who declined to share embers during an emergency, would find himself without assistance when his own systems failed. The harsh environment enforced reciprocity. Survival was not a solo endeavor. It was a negotiation between individual skill and social interdependence. The daubing had to be reapplied. Logs expand in summer heat and contract in winter cold. When cracks opened, the wind found new paths. So every season, settlers would inspect the walls, identify failures, and repair them. The cabin was never finished. It was a living system that required constant intervention. The labor was tedious, exhausting, and endless, but it was the price of warmth. A well-maintained cabin could last decades, housing multiple generations. A neglected cabin became uninhabitable within a few years. The firewood had to be collected, the ice had to be harvested, the meat had to be smoked, the root cellar had to be monitored. Each task was essential. Each required planning, effort, and precision. The settlers who survived were those who understood that staying alive in a 40-below winter was not a single act of heroism, but a series of small, repeated disciplines. The fire bank every night, the daubing checked every spring, the ice cut every January, the meat smoked every autumn. Survival was cumulative, and it was built from routines, not miracles. The knowledge required to execute these routines was not innate. It was inherited. Scandinavian immigrants knew how to notch logs because their ancestors had done it for thousands of years. Shoshone techniques for cold smoking were passed through generations. German house barns reflected centuries of agricultural experience in cold climates. The frontier was not a blank slate. It was a convergence point where multiple knowledge traditions met, competed, and synthesized under extreme pressure. The settlers who thrived were those who recognized effective techniques, regardless of their origin, and adopted them without hesitation. This pragmatism extended to material use. Nothing was wasted. Fat from butchered animals waterproofed daubing and sealed windows. Hair reinforced clay. Bones became structural elements or tool handles. Hides covered beds and blocked drafts. Every component of a slaughtered animal served multiple functions because scarcity demanded efficiency. The frontier economy was circular by necessity. Waste meant vulnerability. Resourcefulness meant survival. The log cabin represented more than shelter. It was a testament to the human capacity to engineer solutions under constraints. The settlers who built these structures did not have access to industrial materials, formal scientific training, or abundant capital. They only had timber, clay, animal products, and inherited knowledge. And from these, they created thermal envelopes capable of maintaining livable conditions in environments that routinely killed unprepared travelers. The cabin was a machine built from biology and stone, powered by fire and fat, maintained through relentless labor. The log cabin did not conquer the wilderness, it negotiated with it. The structure accepted the limitations imposed by climate and material availability, working within them. The settlers accepted the necessity of constant labor and communal interdependence. The result was not a triumph over nature, but rather coexistence with it. Across centuries and continents, in environments where temperatures plunge to 40 below zero, humans have built shelters that keep them alive. The materials differ, the cultural contexts vary, but the principles remain constant. Seal every gap, retain every calorie of heat. Prepare relentlessly during the favorable seasons. Share knowledge and resources when systems fail. The log cabin on the American frontier was one expression of these universal necessities. It was not primitive. It was not crude. It was a sophisticated response to an unforgiving environment, engineered by people who understood that survival required intelligence, flexibility, and the humility to learn from those who had survived before them.